Greetings, everyone. It's great to be here to talk to you on how we can best support autistic people during uncertain times, and in particular, coping and thriving during the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's jump right into it with a little bit about me, what brings me here to talk about autism to you. And taking it from the beginning, things were very typical at first. At 24 hours of age, my wife says I looked like an egg. And then at 18 months, like what happens to about 30% of us on the spectrum, I got struck with the regressive autism bomb, where I lost functional communication, had meltdowns, withdrew from the environment, and in brief, I became a very autistic little kid. There was so little known about autism in those days. So little known that it took my parents a whole year to find a place for diagnosis. And when they did, the doctors said, well, we had never seen such a sick child. We recommend an institutional. Fortunately, my parents, like we see ever increasing numbers of parents today, they advocated on my behalf and they convinced the school to take me in about a year. And it was during that year they implemented what we would today, that was my parents, that is, implemented what we would today refer to as an intensive home-based early intervention program. And it was a program emphasizing music, movement, sensory integration, narration, imitation. It probably looked like one of the more developmental, cognitive, or relational approaches we have today, such as the Miller method, or floor time, or RDI, or maybe daily life therapy, which comes from Japan. And with the work that they did, speech began to return at age 4. So what did my parents do? Well, first, they tried to get me to imitate them. Imitation is a time-honored educational strategy that works most of the time, but for autistic individuals, perhaps due to a difference in mirror neurons, well, it didn't work. So my parents flipped it around and imitated me. And once they did that, I became aware of them in my environment, and they were able to move me along. I believe that we have the technology, we have the know-how, we have the wherewithal, so that autistic individuals leading fulfilling and productive lives can become the rule rather than the exception. So the questions were, when I was diagnosed, and even to today, where does autism come from? What do we do about autism? Although I am hearing more conversation leaning towards what can we do with autism? What can we do to work with autism? And in doing so, we turn away from the closed doors of deficit disorder and disability and look at the open doors of ability and asking the question, what can the person on the autism spectrum do? And keeping this in mind, when we consider uncertain times, COVID-19 to be specific, for 18 months we were locked at home and doing everything remotely. We're now coming out of that and going back to in-person instruction and in-person healthcare. There are some aspects of learning online that can be beneficial for autistic individuals, and we'll take more a look at that later. So continuing on, here I am at age 4. I entered the school that initially rejected me. I got reevaluated. Instead of being considered as psychotic and ready for an institution, I got upgraded to neurotic. So things were moving along. We often hear about the highly focused interests of people on the spectrum. My first one was watches. I was found by my parents taking apart a watch with a sharp knife. I'd pop open the back, I'd extract the motor, remove the gears, spin them around, put it all back together again. The watch still worked, and there weren't any pieces left over. Instead of looking at the closed door of deficit disorder and disability, my parents looked at the open door of ability and soon provided all kinds of other devices to take apart and put together again. They were focusing on my strengths. Now that said, while I do subscribe to a strength-based model of supporting autistic individuals, We do have to recognize that there are some real challenges that often come with autism. We cannot deny them. And we still need to figure these challenges out so that autistic people can achieve their potential, our potential, and making that the rule rather than the exception. Well, what would have happened to me if at that time the COVID-19 pandemic had struck and now I was locked at home and needing to do everything at home? Well, let's take a look in a related situation with Greg the ball thrower. Here's Greg. If there's a ball anywhere in the room, Greg, an elementary school pre-verbal child, will find and throw it. You attempt to remove the ball or keep it away from him, it results in a catastrophic meltdown lasting at least a half hour. This behavior only happens with these objects. It's written in his educational plan that all balls be kept out of sight. He is the type of kid where if this object is in a closed drawer, he can't see it, he'll still find it anyways. As a result of his behavior around these objects, he's considered one of the school's most difficult students. So why is he doing what he's doing? And is there a way to let Greg successfully be in the same room as this object and have it be a benefit? And might we be able to use this object to increase social interaction? So briefly getting into this, in contrast to doing an interest inventory, yeah, do that. Finding what he's interested in and thinking of them as reinforcers, well, yes, they are. However, in contrast to setting up a program where if you do this, then you can play with these objects for a few minutes while you're on break and then go back to work. In this situation, trying that would work for exactly one cycle, and trying to take the object away, that just, well, it didn't work. So what I might do is take a more developmental or relational approach and come into the room with a whole sack of these objects, a sack of balls, big ones, little ones, heavy ones, different colors. And I'd say, here, I'd give him a ball, and what would he do? He'd throw it. Yes, that's exactly what he does. That's what we expect. And set up a routine or a system according to Miller method concepts, theory. And once I have a trusting relationship with the student, now I can expand my work with this ball and perhaps move on to teaching counting or categorization by color, by size, maybe going to another person and getting this object from this other person, maybe working towards shaping the behavior to throwing the ball into a basket. And in that way, working with the highly focused interest to teach academics and to increase social interaction. Well, what has happened is now schools are closed. What are we going to do to support Greg or someone like Greg to maintain and adjust his schedule now at home? How do we communicate these changes in the best way he understands? And also, if you're going to be taking care of Greg and supporting Greg as a parent, therapist, or other support person, what are you going to do to support yourself? So as I think about maintaining and adjusting Greg's school schedule and communication, Greg is pre-verbal. Hopefully he's using some sort of alternative or assistive communication for communicating. Perhaps his schedule is already existing. Picture word schedules already existing at home. And that's the best way Greg communicates. So just like always, get out of bed, engage in your morning routines, have breakfast. All of that's ideally already written out, and he understands that. And things change. Instead of waiting for the bus or however he gets to school, he now goes to a corner of the house or a separate room in the house where there's a computer where Greg is going to learn online. And that gets notated in the schedule. And perhaps the entire family can also have a similar schedule to model what Greg needs to do. And then once school is started, school has the schedule, which the parents get through communication with Greg's educators or therapists, and then all the way to when it's time to, when school is ended. No, you don't take a bus home, but you now walk from where the computer is to another part of the home, and that serves as a transition. And again, we're communicating in the best way Greg understands. And what about self-care to help you support Greg? Well, that brings to mind the big three. So as we saw with Greg, we maintain routines as much as possible. Of course, there's going to be adjustments, and we do so as needed. Instead of going to school, we're going to another section of the house for education. Communication. The best way Greg communicates is through picture word schedule. And what about self-care? What are we going to do to help you care for yourself? Just like the airline attendants tell you to put your own oxygen mask first, so that then you're able to take care of others. You need to take care of yourself, perhaps by taking a break. And it may just be as simple as inhaling and exhaling to calm yourself down. What are some other strategies that are helpful for everybody? And I'm taking from a video that was made by Dina Gasner, an autistic colleague of mine who's finishing a doctoral degree in social work. And things that she brings up in this video include making sure that you remain connected with family, friends, support people, and others who are important to you. And that can be done through perhaps already familiar methods, such as video conferencing, Zoom, or other facsimiles, Facebook Messenger, texting. I know of people who would drive to a friend's home and they'd visit from the safety of their car while their friends were standing in their yard, keeping a safe distance apart. Another thing we need to be aware of is that, in contrast to autistic people not sensing other people's emotions, what I found is that most of us, me included, have a tendency to fuse to other people's emotions, emotional states, and may have difficulty in differentiating between whether that emotion is coming from us or from somebody else. So perhaps if the autistic person is becoming overly anxious, take a look and see if they might be fusing with the emotions of others, maybe watching too much COVID news, or these days with the war going on in Ukraine, watching too much of that and absorbing angst from overloading, watching these things or reading about these things. Then we may need to take a break. Different plans. Gone are the days when we would just hop down to the store on the way home from work to pick up a carton of milk. Well, first of all, we're already home. Well, we were, at least in that case, when we were locked down. And some of us may still be working from home. And it's quite a production to go out and go shopping with all the personal protection equipment that you need. And so you need a plan B. Maybe plan B is to have food delivered. The out of doors is restorative for everyone, autistic and otherwise. So get outside, enjoy the nice day. It's springtime, so it's getting warmer. Just do so in a safe manner. And also, it's important to recognize that keeping safe during the pandemic requires much more cognitive energy. And you may not be as productive as you may have wished. And similarly, the autistic individual may not be as productive as they had wished. So what is out there? There's a lot of information out there online, ranging from Learn Autism, which is parent-driven, research-based video autism portal. There's bite-sized bits of information on how to support an autistic individual. Educational companies thrown their digital doors open and providing free subscriptions and materials. Back when schools were closed, and maybe even now, these materials are still available. As we consider the big three, as we're maintaining our routines, as we're adjusting as needed, maintaining clear communications and self-care, some other strategies might include taking a short yoga break. And this can be just as simple as when you breathe in, you clench your fist and you take a long breath out through your nose, you release the fist. And you do that a few times, and that's going to relax you. And if you need another round, or something a little different, you can do the same thing by pressing your hands together in a prayer position as you breathe in, and then pulling them apart as you breathe out. And it's these tiny little breaks that can be very helpful to all of us, and also something that can be taught, that we can teach the autistic individual as well. Resources for support, social stories. Here's an example of a social story that was developed in Ireland that's very helpful. And this education companies, they came a second time. Well, there's hundreds of thousands of free companies that are listed here, so I guess it's worth seeing a second time. Survival kit, turning to autistic individuals ourselves. That can also be very helpful. And we look at Jean Holverstadt, who lists 19 tips to maintain your mental and physical health, and very helpful during COVID-19 and even when there isn't a pandemic, just helpful tips to maintain good mental and physical health. The Next for Autism is a great organization. Many online resources, how to structure your day. This was not written for COVID, but still it's very helpful for all of us as we strive to structure our day in order to provide the support both for us and the autistic individual we are supporting. Well, we talked about an example with a young child. Children on the spectrum grow up to be adults on the spectrum. And here's an example of Robert, a young autistic adult, would have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome when Asperger's syndrome existed as a diagnosis, maybe as an old diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, now considered needing supports at level 1. And with Robert, he revels in his job that perfectly matches his deep interest in trains and urban transportation system information. For the past 4 years, he's flawlessly provided lost patrons with detailed schedules and transfer connections as needed. His instructions are spot on, and it works with his characteristics. Robert, like so many of us on the spectrum, those of us who speak well, we tend to be detailed, factual, data-driven, truthful, and even repetitive. And those characteristics work, as everybody wants their directions in a detailed manner, and also repetitive. How many of you have asked people to repeat directions when you're lost? However, sometimes Robert rattles these directions off a little bit faster than these patrons are able to keep up. So what can we do to help Robert employ his desire to share information, but at a slower pace? What are some things you might do as Robert's supervisor to implement this plan So certainly we've got to get him to slow down, perhaps role playing, doing it correctly, doing it incorrectly. What I found when supporting autistic individuals in terms of learning, say, hidden curriculum, the hidden curriculum of maintaining proper social distance, is that role playing it correctly and incorrectly can help to analyze exactly what needs to be done. So similarly, the supervisor could give Robert directions at a pace that's way too fast for him to keep up, so that Robert experiences what it's like, and also doing it correctly, saying, giving the directions at a slower pace. Perhaps reminders, little sticky notes around Robert's station, reminding him to slow things down. However, like with Greg at school, Robert's now at home, and he's providing this information via Zoom or some other video conferencing software. How are we going to help Robert maintain his schedule? Well, Robert being speaking well, he probably has the schedule in his head, or maybe he writes it down. He keeps things as the same as possible, morning routines, whatever they are. But instead of commuting to work, he communicates to the other room where his computer is. Communication, as we mentioned, perhaps a word schedule would be the best way to go about it, and self-care to help Robert take care of himself, and for you, if you happen to be supporting someone like Robert. And another strategy, as we see here, just breathing. Breathing, taking note of your breath, and just letting your thoughts run through your mind. So an example for me in terms of self-care is that I tend to be an active person. I ride my bicycle from home to work. Well, now there was no going to work. And I realized that my incidental movements had decreased dramatically, where the only movement I had was walking from one room to the other in order to teach online, just like I'm talking to you now. And that made me realize that I needed to set up a routine where I'd get on my elliptical bike for an hour and a half every second day, week in and week out. And that gave me sufficient movement, at least it felt to me, sufficient movement in which to maintain my health and get the motions and movements that I needed in order to get through my day successfully. So more protocols for being safe at home. Less is more. Oh, let's see. I think we missed some protocols. So let's go back and grab them. Ah, here they are. Number 6, often referred to as self-stimulatory behavior. I prefer to reframe them as self-regulatory behavior. So coping actions. Spin that spinner if that's what's needed. Maybe the autistic person needs to carry their old toy cat that they haven't looked at for the past 2 years. People who are not autistic often knit. And these are all self-regulatory behaviors, and they help us cope with stress as opposed to adding stress. Taking care of yourself so that you can take care of others. We've talked some about that. And if taking a bubble bath with a rubber ducky is what you need to do, then that's exactly what you should do. Continuing to maintain personal health. Again, it's a stressful period of time. We may get forgetful for those who are taking medications. A pill organizer can be helpful in such a situation. Going to the doctor is needed, taking proper precautions as a result. Gloves and masks. Now that we know a little bit more about COVID, we realize that we probably don't need gloves as much as we originally thought we did. And with masks, mask mandates are being lifted, but it's also important to be safe and maintain one's safety in terms of being with others. The term social distancing, I prefer to reframe that as physical distancing, because we're not looking for people to become antisocial, but we are looking to maintain safe distances when necessary. And then there are the protocols for safely returning home, which is what my wife and I do. Less is more. Take as little as possible. Everything that gets brought out has to be disinfected or quarantined on the way in. Again, now we know more about transmission of COVID and realize that it's more airborne as opposed to something that's on the surface. But still, it's best to be safe to disinfect and quarantine. We're in the past items that go out. Where in the past, I'd bring a whole knapsack with my computer and various other things. I slimmed down during the early days to going out with nothing more than my license, one credit card, whatever cash was needed, and the one or two keys that I needed to get back into the house or perhaps drive a car. And that way, much less needed to be cleaned up. Having outdoor shoes and indoor shoes can be helpful. We were sanitizing food for a while. We still quarantine our food on the way in. And some foods can be quarantined better than others, of course. Canned foods, for example, easy to quarantine. Vegetables that need to be in the refrigerator, well, rinse them off and put them in the refrigerator. Showering on the way in, dropping clothes directly into our washing machine, and then washing them to destroy the virus. And again, it's important with all of this additional cognitive load in terms of maintaining safety during a time like this. You're going to be less productive. There'll be less cognitive energy in which to accomplish what you originally would accomplish when there isn't a pandemic. So I want to thank you for your participation and all of your efforts in supporting autistic individuals lead fulfilling and productive lives during these challenging times. And I look forward to our question and answer session on April 29th. Thank you very much.